how does ungrading fit into, like, if kids are used to seeing grades, if they're used to taking all the, taking exams this way, what how would you, I guess, defend ungrading against standardized testing, and how it supports kids?
So I think one of the misconceptions with grades is that grades do not always indicate that learning has occurred.
Agreed.
Grades indicate in a lot of cases where a kid has figured out compliance.
Hmm.
And and I did one of the examples I use is that we have all had the class where a kid has figured out how to hack the system
Hmm.
because they do. It's and that is almost a responsibility that they have is to figure out how to hack the system. And so to give an example, there was a student who was like, yeah, I just figured out with one class, that I could just keep resubmitting the same thing. And it was basically a check off and then they were done. And it's like, okay, so that's clear that, there is an issue between demonstrating learning, assessment, and grading, because assessing and grading and feedback are not the same thing. And a lot of people misinterpret assessment for grading. I can assess a kid's learning without putting a grade on something. And so, an example that I gave you a little earlier, Sheldon, and what I've said to people before is that, it's not, um, you're not going to be able to force a kid to do your work. It doesn't work like that. If I have a student who doesn't submit work, they don't submit work. And I am as human as everybody else, and occasionally I will take that personally when a kid
Hmm.
doesn't submit something. Um, However, what I have come to figure out is that the student who doesn't do the work and doesn't have a collection of that running along the way, when we have an honest conversation about the fact that I don't have any gauge for their learning, they understand, okay, I get this now. I understand why this is not going to translate out into a higher grade. But I also get to determine where the lowest grade is. And that's something that when people talk about getting into gradeless, well, I can't go full on gradeless. Like, what do I do? And I always say that start with something small that you have control over. Like, I can determine that the lowest grade I'm going to assign a kid is a 50%. That's where I started. I
Hmm.
just started there. And what I came to figure out is that the 50% allowed for a student to recover. If I was assigning something lower than a 50, a student couldn't recover. And, third marking period in, if they've gotten a 30%, a 30%, and then third marking period decides, you know what, I think I'm going to try and pull this out, third marking period, and they end up, really much higher grades, it enabled them to recover and pass. What I've also done is prioritize my standards pretty significantly so that a student has multiple times throughout a marking period, throughout a trimester, throughout a year to demonstrate that they are either progressing in mastery of those standards or they are mastering those standards. So doing that as well has really helped that. Um, and what I'm also finding is that this has not negatively impacted a student's ability to take a test.
Okay.
So there's always a question about how does that, we get the same questions around differentiated instruction. It's like but my students are going to have to take a test, so I can't differentiate my instruction. No, you can. You can still totally do that and have a student do well on a test. So it's
Okay.
a conversation I had with my one of my friends is it's like, you have to make a decision as to whether or not you are grading a student or assessing a student, because those are two different things.
This is good stuff. This is good stuff. Okay. So, I want to kind of learn. So, everything makes sense. So, and correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of what I'm gathering is ungrading is very similar to what we're used to seeing. However, we're just kind of saving the grade part to the end, and so we're putting more on the students on and the ownership of the students and their learning, because they're reading the feedback and they're seeing, okay, it's not just, oh, I got an A and I threw this paper away, I got 10 out of 10, I threw it away, but they're actually seeing the feedback and seeing their own
Mhm.
progress. And so that makes sense to me. Walk me through the pitch, the grade pitch time. So, tell me, when does that happen? And what is your rubric, or what metric are you utilizing to kind of support them and say, hey, no, I think you really should have got an F, or you really should have got an A, or whatever it is, right? Walk us through that process.
So what I typically do is I build in reflection time throughout the marking period. So again, we're on trimesters, so that's what my marking period looks like, is 12 weeks. And throughout, they have the ability to reflect on, where do I have demonstrations of these standards being met? Um, where do I have demonstration of my progression toward this? Because again, like, I am very growth minded,
Mhm.
and your students are not going to always, and in my view is that, as a teacher of writing doesn't get mastered. You become a better writer as you go, but you don't master writing. So what happens is that they do some reflecting as they go through. And when we reach the end of the trimester, what they do is they then take the work that they've been looking at throughout the trimester, and they look for, where am I demonstrating my growth and learning of these very, very specific concepts. So with my students, we look at their ability to formulate claims, supply supporting evidence, be able to provide commentary that explains out the connectedness and line of reasoning between claims that they are making and evidence that they have. So we look at those very specific sets of skills. And what they do is they then take their pieces of work to support, here is what that growth looks like for me. So I took the questions, and I think I adapted those questions a little bit, not much, from Sarah Zerwin's book Pointless. So her suggestion was to put those into a Google form, which is what I did. So my students will come to me having prepared to answer those questions. They put that information together. I have had students do this, like, they put together a full presentation, like a Google Slides presentation with, like, each slide representing their work, and that wasn't even something I asked them to do, they just did that. And so we go through and they answer, a series of questions, and what I do while they're talking is I take notes in that form. What I've started to figure out as well is it is helpful when I have students coming to me asking me for recommendations. I go back to what I input on the form, the notes that I took, and I actually pull that up, and that helps me to craft a letter of recommendation for my students. So I basically take that, and the last question I have is, based on the information that you have provided, um, what grade do you feel that you should earn for the course, and how can you support your answer for this? And so we have a discussion. And in a lot of cases, the students are like dead on with where my perception of their growth and their learning is. I have very few students who significantly overpitch. Um, a lot of and it does, the overpitching does occur more the first experience they have with me than it does the second experience that they have doing this, because at that point they've come to develop an understanding around the fact that you cannot come to this conversation without evidence to support where you say you are. And I had a student, I think, like last trimester, tried to pitch a B plus and didn't complete 50% of the work.
Mm.
And I was like, you can't really pitch a B plus when I don't have 50% of the work that you were required to do. So let's talk about realistically what you can pitch. And we came to a conclusion that it was more a C minus based on what was actually submitted in, because the work that was submitted was well done. But demonstrating a limited number of standards that we covered throughout the course, to that point. So the C minus was definitely a lot closer to where he was than what he initially pitched. And it takes some doing to kind of go through that process, because he also wasn't completing all the reflections. and and it's like, I know you haven't reflected, and it's affecting your ability to think clearly through this process right now. So, like, and I keep the grade book pulled up, so I can tell when they start pitching. One of the things that I do is, it's like, if I need to check the grade book, I ask them to pause, and then I look to see kind of where they are, and I'm like, let me show you, because Schoology allows you to do a view as student, and
Mhm.
so I will go in there and I will pull up like what the grade book looks like on the student end for that student. I'm like, so let's talk through what you have here. And I was like, and you see these bits of feedback that I provided to you where you're not demonstrating like that you're like even remotely hitting some of the standards. And then so that allows for that discussion. And it's like they can't argue with something that's right there in front of them that they have been looking at for the entire trimester. So that I find is very helpful as well, and it usually makes things a little bit more real for them.
Are you checking their reflections at all?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yes, they usually, I adapted a reflective form from, I wanna say it's Rachel Kettner, very generously shared out our form, so I adapted that. And depending on the course, so with my freshmen, I guide them more. With my AP students, I don't have to guide them quite as much. With the reflections, I ask them, I'm like, pick from this category, and this category, and they go through and they do that reflection. And that usually is incredibly helpful for seeing kind of where they are. Um, and I find in most cases, the students are usually dead on with where they are with everything.
Okay.
So what the caveat is that if you can demonstrate the growth and the learning, you're not going to get a C in the class. That's a huge concern for my AP kids, especially because a lot of them are already thinking about colleges that they're attempting to apply to.
Right.
And so we look at, I mean, if you hand in every single piece of work, it's well done. You demonstrate that you have made growth and learning, you do the reflections, then in most cases, you're looking at an A range somewhere within, within the A, depending upon, have you submitted every assignment? Are your assignments well done? Because, you collect 2 or 3 assignments, you can tell when a kid blew it off, and just put something on paper to turn something in. Um, so it's definitely made me a lot more mindful of the types of work students are handing in as well.